Some wounds seem healed until the traitor who stabbed you twists the knife again. 12 months after our divorce, I faced my ex-husband and former best friend at a Seattle gala. Holding a baby boy, he ruthlessly mocked my inability to give him a child. He believed he took everything, but facing his arrogant smile, I shed no tears. He was oblivious that his greed had already triggered my perfect trap. Hello? Dear listeners of Zoe Revenge Stories, thank you so much for being here with us today. Unfortunately, our channel has recently been demonetized by YouTube, leaving us without the necessary budget to keep operating. If you find yourself captivated by today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to cover their living expenses and continue bringing these stories to life for you. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the link in the description or comments below. I am Samantha Stevens. I am 34 years old, and tonight I was standing in the glittering grand ballroom of a downtown Seattle hotel, representing Atheris Design Group at the most prestigious annual charity gala of the year. I was at the absolute peak of my career. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the city's elite, illuminating silk gowns and tailored tuxedos. To the outside world, I was the picture of unwavering success and composed elegance. Yet, deep beneath my meticulously tailored exterior, I still carried the invisible, jagged scar of a brutal divorce that had shattered my world exactly 1 year ago. The gentle hum of polite conversation and the clinking of champagne flutes filled the air. I was in the middle of discussing a lucrative contract with a potential client when the crowd seemed to part, as if parting for a storm. My breath hitched. Just for a fraction of a second. Walking toward me was Julian, my ex-husband. Clinging to his arm was Chloe, the woman who had been my absolute best friend for over 10 years. Nestled in Julian's arms was a plump, blonde baby boy, roughly 1 year old. Julian did not just walk past. He steered his new, picture-perfect family directly toward me, his chest puffed out with suffocating arrogance. He halted right in my personal space, making sure we drew the attention of the surrounding guests. "Well, if it is not the brilliant architect herself," Julian announced, his voice booming and dripping with venom, "I must say, Samantha, looking at you now only confirms that leaving you was the most brilliant move I have ever made." He shifted the baby boy in his arms, holding the child up almost like a shiny trophy won in a bitter war. "Look at him, a son, a true heir to carry on my legacy. Chloe gave me the one thing your useless, barren body never could." The surrounding guests fell uncomfortably silent. A normal woman might have crumbled, thrown her drink, or run out of the ballroom in tears. But I am not a normal woman. I maintained an unnervingly cold, professional stillness. I did not blink. I did not flinch. Instead of focusing on Julian's cruel, mocking smile, I shifted my gaze to Chloe. My former best friend did not look like a victorious woman who had stolen a wealthy husband. Beneath her heavy, expensive makeup, her skin was pale and drawn. She actively avoided my eyes, staring intensely at the marble floor. Her knuckles were bone white as she gripped the strap of her evening bag in a death grip. Every few seconds, she would dart a quick, fearful glance up at Julian, like a trapped animal terrified of making the wrong move. There was no joy in her posture, only an overwhelming, suffocating anxiety. Julian, completely oblivious to his wife's terror, continued his loud tirade. "You should also know that my new architecture firm is on the verge of overtaking Atheris Design Group. My EcoCity project is going to secure tens of millions in funding next week. It is amazing what I can achieve with my own creative vision now that you are not around to hold me back and take credit for my genius." He was standing at the absolute peak of his delusion, practically vibrating with triumphant glee. He genuinely thought he had destroyed me. He thought he held all the power. Right at that exact moment of his highest arrogance, the phone inside my clutch vibrated with a sharp, heavy buzz. I slowly unclasped my bag, pulled out the device, and glanced at the glowing screen. It was a secure message from the private investigator I had hired several months ago. The message read, I found the loophole in the medical records. They are putting on a play. A profound, icy sense of clarity washed over my mind. The heavy weight I had carried for 12 months evaporated into the opulent air of the ballroom. I looked up from my phone, meeting Julian's expectant, malicious gaze. Slowly, a small, elegant smile curved on my lips. It was a smile of pure, dangerous knowing. "Congratulations on your beautiful little family, Julian," I said, my voice smooth as silk and cold as ice. "And good luck with your EcoCity project. I truly wish you exactly the success you deserve." Without waiting for his response, I gave a brief, polite nod to the terrified Chloe, turned my back on them both, and walked away with the graceful, measured steps of a queen who already knew she had won the war. The morning after the gala, the Seattle sky was heavy with gray clouds, pouring a relentless drizzle over the city. I sat in a dimly lit, out-of-the-way coffee shop near the docks, far from the polished marble floors of the elite circles. Across the sticky wooden table sat Marcus, the private investigator I had retained. Between us rested 2 cups of black coffee and a thick manila folder that held the weight of my impending retribution. To understand the depth of the betrayal, you have to look back to the chaotic final months of my marriage. Julian did not just walk away with my supposed best friend. He executed a calculated corporate robbery while we were arguing over furniture and bank accounts. He was quietly slipping into my home office at night. I had spent 4 years pouring my soul into the conceptual design of the EcoCity, a revolutionary, sustainable urban center. Julian stole the core schematics, filed for divorce, and immediately launched his own architectural firm. Within weeks, using my genius as his own, he pitched the concept to venture capitalists and secured tens of millions of dollars in initial funding. He built an entire empire on the foundation of my stolen intellect. Marcus took a slow sip of his coffee and slid the heavy folder toward me. "Your ex-husband is moving at an insane pace," Marcus said, his voice low and gravelly. "His firm is burning through that investor cash like dry kindling. They have already broken ground on the EcoCity Central Tower. Construction crews are working around the clock, double shifts, trying to get the framework up." A genuine, uncontainable laugh escaped my lips, echoing slightly in the quiet cafe. It was not a bitter laugh. It was a sound of pure, crystalline amusement. Marcus raised an eyebrow in confusion. "Let them build," I replied, tracing the rim of my coffee cup. "Let them pour every single cent into that central tower." I leaned in closer, dropping my voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Julian was a charismatic talker, but he was a terrible architect. When I realized he was sneaking into my office during our separation, I decided to leave a very specific set of blueprints right out in the open. It was a bait, and he swallowed it whole. The schematic he stole and subsequently used to secure his massive funding was not the finalized design. It was a discarded, deliberately flawed draft. I had introduced a microscopic mathematical error into the load-bearing calculations for the foundation. It was a discrepancy of perhaps 0.3%, completely invisible to the naked eye on a piece of paper, and easily overlooked by the mediocre engineers Julian had rushed to hire. However, physics is completely unforgiving. The foundation they were currently pouring would hold up just fine for the first few levels. But the moment the construction reached the 10th floor, the compounded weight and the flawed stress distribution would trigger catastrophic structural failure. Massive, unfixable cracks would tear through the concrete. The entire project would be condemned before they even installed the windows. "He is building his own tombstone," I explained, a cold satisfaction settling in my chest. "But what about the message you sent me last night at the gala? The medical loophole." Marcus opened the folder, revealing a stack of heavily redacted legal and medical documents. The atmosphere at the table grew significantly heavier. "This is where it gets truly twisted," Marcus said, tapping a finger on a copy of a dense legal will. "Julian did not suddenly develop a burning paternal instinct. This is about his grandfather, the patriarch of the Vance family. The old man was a ruthless traditionalist. He left behind a trust fund worth exactly $50 million, but there was a draconian stipulation attached to the money. It would only be released to a male heir of direct, undisputed bloodline. Marcus flipped to the next page, showing financial bank statements. Julian's new firm might have raised millions, but because of his reckless spending and mismanagement, they are actually drowning in debt. He is secretly bankrupt. He desperately needed that $50 million to keep his stolen Eco-City project afloat, but the grandfather's will had a strict expiration date for the heir to be born. The puzzle pieces snapped together in my mind with terrifying clarity. Julian realized he was running out of time and money. He seduced Chloe, rushed her to the altar the moment our divorce was finalized, and pressured her to produce a child immediately. The blonde baby boy I saw last night was not a symbol of their blossoming love. That child was nothing more than a hastily manufactured key to unlock a $50 million vault. They manufactured a family just to meet a legal deadline, I murmured, staring at the documents. Exactly, Marcus confirmed. He is using the baby to pressure the estate lawyers into releasing the funds before his construction creditors realize he is completely broke. I looked out the window at the rain-slicked streets. Julian thought he was an unstoppable mastermind. He believed his stolen blueprints would bring him glory, and his new son would bring him limitless wealth. But in reality, he was sprinting blindly across a painfully thin sheet of ice. Beneath him was a freezing, bottomless abyss of his own making. He had no idea that the ice was already cracking under the weight of a doomed building, and I was about to swing the hammer that would shatter his entire world into a million jagged pieces. Over the next 3 weeks, I became a silent ghost haunting the edges of Chloe's carefully curated, utterly miserable world. I knew her daily habits better than she probably knew them herself. I knew she preferred the organic market on Fifth Avenue on Tuesday mornings and the high-end boutique down the street on Thursday afternoons. I began to strategically place myself in her peripheral vision. I never approached her. I never spoke a single word. I simply let my presence linger like a cold, inescapable draft. The woman who had proudly stood beside my ex-husband at the gala was rapidly disintegrating before my eyes. The glamorous facade was peeling away, revealing the rot underneath. Every time I spotted her from across a busy street or down a grocery aisle, she looked remarkably more gaunt, dark. Bruising circles hollowed out her eyes, making her look incredibly fragile. Her hands trembled constantly when she reached for items. Most tellingly, she was never, ever alone. A large, stone-faced man in a tailored dark suit shadowed her every step. Julian had hired a private bodyguard. It was ostensibly for her protection, but the way the massive man steered her by the elbow, dictating her pace and her stops, made the reality abundantly clear. He was a warden, and Chloe was a prisoner out on a highly monitored yard release. I decided it was time to address the situation directly. On a rainy Friday afternoon, I caught up with her at the sprawling luxury shopping center downtown. I waited patiently until her imposing escort took his position outside the designer restroom, confident she was alone inside. I quietly made my way in through the secondary staff entrance. The room was brilliantly lit, carrying the scent of expensive floral perfume and crisp cleaning supplies. Chloe was standing by the marble sinks, gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles were completely white. I watched through the mirror's reflection as she hurriedly fumbled with a small prescription bottle, tipping a couple of pills into her trembling palm and swallowing them dry to calm her nerves. I stepped forward from the alcove and walked up to the sink right beside her. I turned on the gold faucet, letting the warm water wash over my hands, and finally shifted my gaze to meet her eyes in the mirror. She gasped loudly, dropping her expensive leather bag to the tiled floor. The metallic clasp clattered sharply, echoing against the walls. She looked utterly broken. Tears instantly welled up in her bloodshot, terrified eyes. "Samantha," she choked out, her voice a fragile, raspy whisper that barely carried over the sound of the running water. "You have to understand. I did not want this. He is suffocating me. There is something you need to know about the baby. Julian does not know that I know. But the baby is—" Before she could finish her desperate sentence, The heavy wooden door was pushed open with violent force. The bodyguard stepped inside, completely disregarding the privacy and sanctity of the women's restroom. "Mrs. Vance, your husband is expecting you at home, right now." Chloe's jaw snapped shut instantly. The sheer terror in her eyes was absolute and undeniable. She scrambled to pick up her bag and practically ran out the door, leaving the lingering, pathetic scent of her fear behind in the cold room. Her panicked, unfinished confession echoed in my mind for days. Julian's obsession with total control was a psychological disease I knew intimately. During our marriage, whenever something went wrong, he spun a masterful web of reality where I was always the unstable, defective one. When we struggled to conceive a child, he vehemently refused to set foot in a medical clinic, loudly declaring to our families that the flaw was entirely within my, as he cruelly called it, barren and useless body. I bore that silent, crushing shame for years. But seeing Chloe's sheer terror and knowing Julian was desperate enough to steal architectural blueprints, I knew his deception ran significantly deeper than just a rushed marriage to a younger woman. I contacted my private investigator again, authorizing him to dig into the deepest, most secure digital archives regarding Chloe's maternity, using anonymous, fully legal data brokers and bypassing highly encrypted hospital firewalls. My investigator unearthed a truth that was far darker and more twisted than I had ever anticipated. The hospital birth records for the boy were a complete, wildly expensive fabrication. There was no legitimate admission date, no attending physician signature that could be verified by the medical board, and zero biological history of a pregnancy. Chloe had never given birth. The blonde boy was procured through a highly discreet, shadowy private adoption broker catering specifically to desperate, wealthy individuals who needed a child fast. But the most staggering revelation, the piece of information that made me sit back in my office chair and stare at the ceiling in pure, unadulterated disbelief, was the medical file Julian had desperately tried to scrub from existence. It was a file from a highly confidential private clinic dating back exactly 5 years ago. Julian was entirely, irreversibly sterile. His medical report indicated a 0% chance of natural conception. He had a 0 sperm count. He had known this entire time, throughout our entire marriage, while I wept endlessly over negative pregnancy tests and endured his relentless, cruel insults about my inadequacy as a woman. He knew he was the one shooting blanks. He had projected his own biological failure onto me to protect his fragile, monstrous, narcissistic ego. And now, this sterile fraud had purchased an innocent child to use as a literal prop. He bought a baby to trick his billionaire grandfather into handing over $50 million, all while strutting around Seattle playing the role of the proud, virile patriarch. The dramatic irony was almost poetic in its perfection. Julian walked around like a conquering king, completely unaware that I held the undisputed, documented proof of his fake son, his fake architecture, and his fake manhood. The power resting in my hands was absolute. I could pick up the phone and end his miserable empire right then and there on a random Tuesday. But true revenge is a dish best served freezing cold. I was not going to strike while he was merely vulnerable in the shadows. I was going to wait until he was standing at the very top of his stolen, crumbling castle, surrounded by the powerful investors and family members he had conned, so the fall would utterly and permanently destroy him. The steel and concrete beast of Julian's Eco-City Central Tower finally clawed its way up to the 10th floor. It was a brisk Tuesday morning when the immutable laws of physics decided to collect their inevitable debt. The microscopic flaw I had planted in the foundation schematics was fully activated by the sheer, compounding weight of thousands of tons of raw materials. It did not happen with a sudden, explosive crash, but rather with a horrifying, agonizing groan that echoed across the entire downtown construction site like a dying leviathan. Spiderweb fractures sprinted up the primary load-bearing pillars of the subterranean parking levels. Chunks of gray concrete the size of small vehicles violently sheared off the main supports and plummeted to the ground, kicking up massive clouds of toxic dust. By noon, The city's Department of Building Inspection had swarmed the site like a hive of angry hornets. They took one look at the laser stress measurements showing the severe structural warping and immediately shut the entire operation down. Thick yellow tape and bright red stop-work orders plastered the chain-link fences. The towering construction cranes froze in the sky, suddenly transformed into rusty monuments of his impending doom. The financial panic was instantaneous and utterly ruthless. The venture capitalists, who had blindly thrown tens of millions of dollars into Julian's lap, saw their golden goose turning into a monumental, radioactive liability. They cornered him in his sleek, glass-walled office, screaming until they were red in the face about gross negligence, breach of fiduciary duty, and threatening to pull every single cent of their remaining capital before the sun went down. Backed into a corner with his counterfeit empire crumbling around his ears and his creditors circling like sharks, Julian resorted to his only remaining lifeline. He relentlessly bombarded the conservative lawyers managing his grandfather's estate. He demanded the immediate release of the $50 million trust fund. He used the innocent child as his ultimate, shameless bargaining chip, shouting into his phone that his son, the glorious Vance heir, deserved his rightful inheritance right this second to secure the family legacy and stabilize the business. He was desperately trying to plug a sinking battleship with a wad of cash that did not even belong to him yet. But the local media had already caught the thick scent of blood in the water. News helicopters circled the cracked, groaning tower all afternoon, desperate to distract the furious public and the panicked investors from his own catastrophic incompetence. Julian orchestrated a hasty, cowardly press conference on the steps of City Hall. I watched the live broadcast on my office monitor, slowly sipping a glass of iced lemon water. He stood behind a wooden podium, sweating profusely under the harsh glare of the camera lights, and pointed his trembling finger directly at my firm. He insinuated, with zero evidence, that the structural failure was not an engineering mistake, but rather a deliberate, malicious act of corporate sabotage orchestrated by bitter remnants of Aetheris Design Group. He played the victim perfectly, his voice cracking as he claimed his brilliant, original vision was being violently attacked by jealous rivals who simply could not stand to see him succeed without them. A lesser woman would have immediately called a counter-press conference to scream her innocence into the microphones and beg the public for belief. I chose a far more lethal, silent route. I let him lie on national television. I let him dig his grave a little deeper. Then, quietly and with devastating efficiency, my elite legal team marched into the federal courthouse and filed a massive, airtight lawsuit against Julian for egregious intellectual property theft and corporate espionage. We did not just submit angry accusations, we submitted a mountain of indisputable, cold digital forensics. We provided the judge with server logs, time-stamped original drafts, and the exact metadata from the night he illicitly downloaded my private files onto his encrypted flash drive. We had definitive proof that the mathematical error crippling the building was actually my own intellectual property, stolen and misused by a man who simply did not understand the complex formulas he was stealing. The federal marshals bypassed his receptionists and served him the massive stack of legal papers right in the middle of a frantic, screaming board meeting. However, the true fatal masterstroke did not even come from me or my lawyers. It came from the cold, unfeeling machinery of the Vance family trust itself. Just hours after Julian received my federal lawsuit, the lead estate attorney sent a certified, armed courier to Julian's lavish estate with a final, non-negotiable legal directive. The extended family members, smelling the blood in the water from the failing construction project and the massive federal lawsuit, had formally contested the payout of the $50 million to protect the massive estate from future litigation and fraud. The conservative lawyers instituted one final mandatory hurdle before a single dollar could be transferred to Julian's frozen accounts. They demanded a court-ordered, independent DNA test between Julian and the baby boy to absolutely verify the direct biological bloodline. The test had to be conducted within 48 hours at a highly secure medical facility chosen entirely by the estate. under strict third-party supervision, leaving absolutely no room for bribery, tampering, or delay. The invisible net I had cast was no longer just tightening. It had completely closed around his throat, cutting off his air supply. Julian had nowhere left to run. He could not fix the broken, sinking building. He could not fight my federal lawsuit because the digital footprint was completely bulletproof. And most devastatingly, he could not provide the one biological truth required to save his stolen fortune. His elaborate web of lies was colliding in a spectacular, inescapable, high-speed crash. The absolute terror of the mandatory DNA test shattered the last remaining fragments of Julian's sanity. For a man who had spent his entire adult life manipulating the truth, facing a sterile, unbribable scientific fact was a death sentence. Within an hour of receiving the legal directive from the trust, Julian was acting like a cornered, rabid animal. He frantically liquidated whatever remaining cash he could access, stuffing $50,000 into a leather briefcase. He arranged a desperate, late-night meeting with the head technician of the designated testing facility in a dark parking lot. He practically threw the money at the man, begging him to swap the blood samples, but the technician shoved the briefcase back into Julian's chest, his face pale with fear. The estate lawyers had anticipated this exact maneuver. They had stationed 2 independent armed security contractors inside the laboratory, monitoring every single test tube around the clock. There was absolutely zero margin for corruption. Julian was officially trapped. When Julian returned to his lavish, heavily mortgaged mansion that night, the sheer weight of his impending destruction ignited a terrifying rage. He unleashed a torrent of psychological abuse on Chloe. He screamed that she was worthless, that she had failed to play her part properly, and that if they lost the $50 million, he would personally ensure she ended up on the streets with nothing. The relentless screaming, the smashing of expensive vases against the walls, and the terrifying look in his eyes finally snapped something deep inside Chloe. She realized with chilling certainty that Julian was no longer just a manipulative liar. He was a highly dangerous, desperate man who would easily sacrifice her and the baby to save his own skin. She waited until Julian, exhausted from his violent tantrum, passed out in his study with a half-empty bottle of scotch. The private bodyguard was dozing in the security vehicle parked in the driveway, moving with the silent, desperate adrenaline of a hunted prey. Chloe packed a single duffel bag with baby supplies, wrapped the child in a heavy blanket, and slipped out through the kitchen service door. She fled into the pouring Seattle rain, driving her car aimlessly for hours, terrified of being followed, until she realized there was only one person in the entire city who possessed the power and the intelligence to shield her from Julian's wrath. At 2:00 in the morning, the heavy brass knocker on my front door echoed through my silent house. I opened the door to find Chloe standing on my porch, drenched to the bone, shivering violently, and clutching the crying baby boy to her chest. Her face was a portrait of absolute, raw devastation. I did not say a word. I simply stepped aside and let them into the warmth of my hallway. We sat in my living room, the only sound the steady drumming of the rain against the glass and the soft breathing of the baby sleeping on my sofa. Chloe wrapped her trembling hands around a mug of hot tea and finally confessed the ultimate, hidden layer of her betrayal. "The private investigator you hired only saw the surface of the lie," Chloe whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her guilt. "Julian forced me to fake the hospital records. He told me that since he was completely sterile, we had to pretend to use a highly exclusive, anonymous sperm donor through a private broker to get a child fast enough to claim the trust fund. He thought he had complete control over the narrative. He thought the baby was just a random biological product he bought with a check." She looked down at her hands, tears spilling over her bruised, exhausted eyes. "But I could not do it. Samantha, I could not raise a complete stranger's child while being married to a monster. Before Julian and I got married, right after you and he separated, I secretly went to my ex-boyfriend. I begged him to help me. I underwent artificial insemination using his sperm. The baby is not adopted. He is not from an anonymous donor. He is my actual, biological son with the man I used to love. Julian has absolutely no idea. He walks around believing he bought a prop from a clinic, completely oblivious to the fact that he is parading around another man's flesh and blood. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the sheer staggering magnitude of the deception. The lies were stacked upon lies in a towering, unstable house of cards. Chloe had betrayed me to marry Julian. Julian had betrayed me to steal my work. And Chloe had betrayed Julian to secure her own biological child. It was a chaotic, toxic masterpiece of human greed. "Please, Samantha," Chloe begged, dropping to her knees on my hardwood floor. "I know I destroyed our friendship. I know I deserve everything bad that happens to me. But Julian will kill me when the DNA test reveals the truth. He will hurt the baby. I have nowhere else to go." I looked at the sleeping infant. He was completely innocent, unknowingly thrust into the center of a multi-million-dollar war built on vanity and theft. My heart, which had been frozen solid for the past 12 months, cracked just a fraction. "Get up," I commanded, my voice firm and unwavering. "I will provide you and the boy with a secure, untraceable safe house outside the city limits. I have security personnel who answer only to me, but make no mistake, Chloe, I am not doing this because I forgive you. You and I will never be friends again. I am doing this because no child deserves to be collateral damage in Julian's pathetic, delusional game." By dawn, Julian awoke to find the mansion completely empty. His wife was gone. His baby was gone. His $50 million ticket out of bankruptcy had vanished into thin air. He completely lost his mind. He tore through the city like a hurricane, screaming at his security guards, threatening his staff, and frantically calling the police to report a kidnapping. He even called a local news station, ranting hysterically that his mentally unstable wife had abducted his precious heir. He was flailing wildly, desperate to regain control of a narrative that had already slipped through his fingers. But the universe was not finished with him yet. That very same evening, exactly as the evening news began to broadcast Julian's frantic kidnapping claims, the city's Department of Building Inspection publicly released their official, independent forensic report regarding the EcoCity Tower collapse. The 40-page document was utterly merciless. It did not mention sabotage. It did not mention Aetheris Design Group. Instead, it explicitly detailed that the catastrophic structural failure was the direct result of elementary, humiliating incompetence. The report stated that the lead architect, Julian Vance, had completely failed to comprehend basic load-bearing mathematics on the blueprints he submitted. He had essentially tried to build a skyscraper using the foundational logic of a garden shed. The report was instantly picked up by every major architectural publication and financial network in the country. In the span of a single night, Julian's carefully crafted persona was entirely obliterated. He was no longer a visionary genius. He was officially exposed to the entire world as a pathetic, incompetent fraud who could not even read the plans he had stolen. The storm had finally broken, and the torrential rain was washing away his entire empire. The ultimate reckoning took place in the sterile, glass-walled boardroom on the highest floor of the Vance family corporate headquarters. I stood just outside the heavy double doors, flanked by Chloe, who was holding her sleeping son, and my lead corporate attorney. Through the soundproof glass, we could see Julian pacing frantically at the head of the massive mahogany table. He was sweating profusely, his tie loosened, practically begging the stern-faced men seated around him. At the opposite end sat his billionaire grandfather, a man carved from ice and old money, alongside a panel of furious investors and the estate lawyers. Julian slammed his hands onto the table. "You have to release the $50 million immediately," he pleaded, his voice muffled but desperate. "Chloe is suffering from severe postpartum depression. That is the only reason she took the baby and fled. She is mentally unstable, but he is still my son. He is the Vance heir. If you do not wire the funds today, the creditors will seize everything." I gave a brief nod to my attorney. He pushed the heavy glass doors open, the sudden noise silencing the entire room. All eyes snapped toward the entrance as I stepped into the boardroom, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. Chloe followed closely behind me, her gaze firmly fixed on the floor, while the baby shifted quietly in her arms. Julian froze, all the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow ghost. "Samantha," he sputtered, his voice trembling. "What are you doing here? Get out!" I ignored him completely. I walked straight past his trembling figure and stopped directly in front of his grandfather. With slow, deliberate precision, I placed two thick black leather folders onto the center of the mahogany table. "Gentlemen," I began, my voice echoing with absolute authority in the cavernous room. "I apologize for the interruption, but I believe it is time to conclude this pathetic charade. Inside the first folder, you will find irrefutable, digital forensics, proving that the EcoCity project was built entirely on stolen intellectual property. Furthermore, the catastrophic collapse was not an accident. Julian stole a discarded, mathematically flawed draft from my office because he lacks the fundamental architectural intelligence to understand basic structural engineering." The investors gasped, immediately lunging for the first folder. I placed my hand firmly on the second folder, locking eyes with Julian's grandfather. "And inside this second folder," I continued, my tone dropping to a chilling calm, "is the official, court-ordered DNA test you requested. The results are conclusive. The child in this room shares absolutely 0% of your bloodline. Julian is, and has always been, entirely sterile. He orchestrated a massive fraud to steal $50 million from this estate." The silence that followed was absolute and deafening. Julian snapped. He let out a primal, guttural scream, lunging toward Chloe, violently blaming her, blaming me, and cursing the lawyers. Two of the grandfather's personal security guards instantly tackled him to the floor, pinning him against the expensive rug. The old billionaire slowly opened the medical file, his eyes scanning the certified results. When he looked down at his grandson writhing on the floor, his expression was one of pure, unadulterated disgust. "You are no longer a Vance," the grandfather stated, his voice like cracking thunder. "You are completely disinherited. Remove this criminal from my building." Simultaneously, the lead investor pulled out his phone and dialed the police, loudly reporting a multi-million-dollar financial fraud. As the guards dragged a sobbing, screaming Julian out of the boardroom, I turned to the remaining men at the table. "Now for the solution," I said, offering a cold, businesslike smile. Aetheris Design Group is prepared to acquire the entirety of Julian's bankrupt firm, including the EcoCity site and all its current liabilities, for exactly one single penny. In exchange, I will utilize my original, flawless blueprints to salvage the foundation and complete the project the right way. The room agreed without a moment of hesitation. They were desperate for a savior, and I was the only one holding the lifeline. A few months later, the dust had finally settled. Julian was sitting in a federal holding cell, entirely penniless and awaiting trial for corporate espionage and massive financial fraud, facing decades behind bars. Chloe had taken her son and quietly relocated to a small, hidden town in a Midwestern state to start a completely new life. She sent me a long, tear-stained letter of profound apology, which I read once before burning in my fireplace. On a brilliant, sunlit Tuesday afternoon, I took the construction elevator up to the highest completed framework of the newly salvaged EcoCity Central Tower. The Seattle skyline stretched out before me, vast and limitless, beneath a perfectly clear blue sky. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the old diamond engagement ring Julian had given me years ago. I did not look at it with sadness or anger. I simply dropped it into a nearby metal waste bin, listening to the satisfying clink as it hit the bottom. I took a deep, grounding breath of the crisp, fresh air. I was no longer the heartbroken victim of a cruel betrayal. I was the undisputed queen standing at the very top of the empire I had rightfully reclaimed. The storm was finally over, and my future had never looked so incredibly bright. Hello again. Dear listeners, Thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying with me until the very end of this journey. I would love to know where you are listening from today, so please let me know in the comments. If you found today's story engaging and satisfying, please consider helping our channel with just a $1 donation. You can do this easily by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by using the PayPal link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. Your generous support allows us to pay our dedicated team, helping them feed their families, and ensures we can continue creating even better stories for you all. Thank you so much, and take care.